A seemingly calm daytime conversation quietly shifted, revealing tension that no one expected live on air. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Not through raised voices or dramatic walk-offs, but through a quiet, persistent disagreement that slowly reshapes the tone of the entire table. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The moment unfolded during what initially appeared to be a standard daytime interview segment. Joaquin Phoenix was seated at the table alongside the hosts, there to discuss his latest project and a broader conversation about the themes it explored, including responsibility, public influence, and the way media narratives shape public thinking. The atmosphere at the top of the segment was calm and familiar to regular viewers. The hosts exchanged light remarks, the audience responded with polite applause, and Joaquin Phoenix appeared reserved but engaged, speaking in measured sentences and often pausing before answering, a trait viewers have come to recognize as part of his on-camera demeanor. As the conversation progressed, it gradually shifted from the film itself into a broader cultural discussion. One of the co-hosts raised a question about whether celebrities have a responsibility to speak clearly on social issues, especially when their work touches on sensitive topics. Joaquin responded carefully, emphasizing that while artists can provoke thought, they cannot control interpretation, and that audiences bring their own experiences into what they watch. His tone remained even, and the hosts nodded along, with brief interjections that kept the discussion moving. It was when Whoopi Goldberg entered the exchange more directly that the tone began to subtly change. Whoopi framed her point around the idea that public figures, especially those with wide reach, must be conscious of how their words and silences can be interpreted. She spoke from her position as both a longtime entertainer and a talk show host, suggesting that neutrality is often read as avoidance. Her delivery was firm but conversational, the way viewers are accustomed to hearing her weigh in on complex issues without embellishment. Joaquin listened attentively, leaning slightly forward, hands loosely clasped, eyes focused on Whoopi as she spoke. When she finished, there was a brief pause that felt longer than usual for daytime television. It wasn't uncomfortable yet, but it signaled that Joaquin was choosing his response carefully. When he began to speak, his voice was calm, but his phrasing made it clear that he did not fully agree with the premise. He explained that silence is not always disengagement, and that sometimes restraint comes from understanding the limits of one's perspective. He noted that speaking simply to fill space can do more harm than good, particularly when complex social issues are reduced to sound bites. As he spoke, one of the co-hosts glanced toward Whoopi, sensing the divergence in viewpoints, while another nodded slightly at Joaquin's explanation. Whoopi responded almost immediately, clarifying that her point was not about forcing commentary, but about recognizing the influence that comes with visibility. She referenced moments in her own career where staying quiet had been interpreted in ways she hadn't intended, and how she learned that audiences often look for guidance, even when none is explicitly offered. Her tone remained steady, but the pacing quickened slightly, signaling that the exchange was moving beyond casual discussion. The audience reacted with a mix of murmurs and light applause at different moments, reflecting that the points on both sides were landing. Joaquin maintained a respectful posture, occasionally nodding as Whoopi spoke, but when he replied again, he gently pushed back on the idea that influence automatically equals obligation. He emphasized personal responsibility over public expectation, suggesting that authenticity matters more than performative statements. At this point, the table dynamic shifted. Other hosts began to interject more frequently, not to escalate the disagreement, but to keep it balanced. One co-host reframed Joaquin's point by asking whether there is a middle ground between silence and overstatement. Joaquin agreed that balance is important, but reiterated that the pressure to comment can sometimes undermine genuine dialogue. Whoopi, in turn, acknowledged the complexity, but stood by her belief that awareness of impact should always be part of the equation. The exchange never became heated, but viewers could sense the tension in the rhythm of the conversation. The usual light banter was replaced by careful phrasing and deliberate pauses. Body language became more telling than words at times, with Joaquin sitting back slightly after making a point, and Whoopi maintaining steady eye contact as she listened and responded. As the segment continued, the moderator steered the discussion back toward how these themes connect to Joaquin's work, offering a natural transition that kept the conversation appropriate for daytime television. Joaquin responded by tying his perspective back to storytelling, explaining that his goal as an actor is to present questions rather than answers. Whoopi acknowledged this, adding that talk shows exist precisely to wrestle with those questions in real time, in front of an audience. The studio audience responded with applause, not in support of one side over the other, but as recognition of a thoughtful exchange. The tension softened slightly, and the hosts exchanged brief smiles, signaling that the discussion had reached a comfortable pause. Joaquin thanked the hosts for the conversation, and Whoopi returned the thanks, noting that respectful disagreement is part of meaningful dialogue. As the segment wrapped up, viewers were left with the sense that they had witnessed a genuine moment of perspective sharing rather than a manufactured clash. The disagreement had unfolded slowly, grounded in real experiences and differing philosophies, handled with professionalism and restraint. It was the kind of exchange that doesn't dominate headlines for drama, but lingers with audiences because it reflects the complexity of real conversations happening in living rooms across the country. And as the show moved on to its next segment, the subtle shift in energy served as a reminder of how live television can capture unscripted moments of thoughtful disagreement, offering viewers not conclusions, but something to consider as the conversation continues. As the conversation continued after that initial exchange, the atmosphere at the table settled into a quieter, more deliberate rhythm. The hosts seemed aware that the discussion had reached a point where every word mattered, and the pacing adjusted accordingly. Joaquin Phoenix remained composed, his posture relaxed but attentive, while Whoopi Goldberg held her position with the ease of someone who has navigated countless live debates over the years. For viewers watching at home, it felt less like a confrontation and more like two experienced voices examining the same issue from different angles, neither rushing to dominate the moment. One of the co-hosts gently reframed the discussion by asking Joaquin how he personally decides when to speak publicly and when to step back. The question wasn't confrontational, but it carried weight, especially given the exchange that had just taken place. Joaquin took a moment before answering, glancing briefly down at the table, then back up at the panel. He explained that his decisions are often guided by context rather than expectation. He spoke about listening first, reading widely, and trying to understand an issue before attaching his voice to it. His tone was steady, almost reflective, and the studio audience remained quiet, listening closely. Whoopi responded by acknowledging that approach, saying she understood the desire to avoid oversimplification. However, she reiterated that public silence can sometimes be interpreted as indifference, regardless of intention. She spoke calmly, but there was a firmness beneath her words that suggested this was a belief shaped by experience rather than theory. She referenced her years in the public eye, noting how often she had seen narratives form in the absence of clear statements. Her point wasn't accusatory, but it challenged the idea that intention alone determines impact. The exchange drew subtle reactions from the other hosts. One leaned back slightly, arms crossed loosely, watching the back and forth unfold. Another nodded intermittently, signaling agreement with parts of both arguments. These small gestures added to the sense that the table itself was divided, not sharply, but thoughtfully. It mirrored what many viewers likely felt, an understanding of both perspectives, without an easy resolution. Joaquin responded again, this time emphasizing that he doesn't believe silence absolves anyone of responsibility, but that speaking without depth can create its own problems. He mentioned how soundbite culture can distort nuanced positions, especially on social media, where context is often lost. As he spoke, his hands moved slightly, palms open, a gesture that conveyed openness rather than defensiveness. His voice remained even, and there was no visible frustration, only a desire to clarify his stance. Whoopi listened closely, her expression serious but engaged. When she replied, she shifted the focus slightly, pointing out that daytime television itself operates within that same soundbite-driven environment. She noted that shows like theirs try to create space for nuance, even within limited time. Her implication was clear. If there's any place for careful discussion, it's platforms that encourage dialogue rather than headlines. The audience responded with light applause, recognizing the meta-nature of the point. At this stage, the moderator stepped in briefly to keep the segment flowing. She acknowledged that the conversation had touched on something many viewers grapple with: the balance between speaking up and staying thoughtful. Her tone was neutral, serving as a bridge rather than a judgment. She then invited another co-host to weigh in, broadening the discussion and easing the focus away from a one-on-one exchange. That co-host offered a perspective centered on audience expectations. She suggested that viewers often look to public figures not for definitive answers, but for signals of values. Joaquin nodded at this, agreeing that values matter, but he cautioned against confusing visibility with authority. He stressed that being known doesn't necessarily mean being informed on every issue, and that pretending otherwise can erode trust. Whoopi responded with a slight smile, acknowledging the point while still holding her ground. She said that she wasn't advocating for experts on every topic, but for honesty about where one stands. She argued that saying, "I'm still learning," or "I don't have all the answers," can be more powerful than silence, because it invites others into the process. This moment seemed to resonate with the audience, drawing a more sustained round of applause. The body language around the table softened slightly after that. Joaquin leaned back, nodding thoughtfully, and even offered a brief smile of agreement. He acknowledged that transparency about uncertainty can be valuable, and clarified that his concern is more about pressure than participation. The distinction was subtle but important, and it seemed to bring the two perspectives closer together, even if they didn't fully align. Throughout this part of the segment, interruptions were minimal, but when they happened, they were gentle and purposeful. The hosts were careful not to talk over one another, a sign that they recognized the seriousness of the discussion. The usual quick jokes and asides that often characterize daytime talk shows were noticeably absent, replaced by a more measured tone that reflected the gravity of the topic. The audience remained engaged, reacting not with laughter, but with murmurs and applause at key moments. It was clear that viewers were following the conversation closely, appreciating the respect shown on both sides. There was no sense of escalation, but there was tension in the sense that the topic itself carried weight, and that neither side was offering an easy answer. As the conversation edged toward its midpoint, the moderator glanced at the clock, subtly signaling that time was moving on. She steered the discussion back toward Joaquin's work, asking how these ideas influence the roles he chooses. Joaquin welcomed the shift, explaining that he's drawn to stories that raise questions rather than deliver messages. He spoke about trusting audiences to engage critically, rather than telling them what to think. Whoopi responded by connecting that idea back to the earlier discussion, noting that storytelling itself is a form of communication that carries influence, whether intended or not. She said this without accusation, framing it as an observation rather than a critique. Joaquin agreed, acknowledging that art inevitably shapes conversation, even when it resists clear conclusions. This moment marked a subtle turning point. The disagreement didn't disappear, but it became less about opposing views and more about shared concerns approached differently. The tension eased, replaced by a sense of mutual respect. The hosts exchanged brief glances, as if recognizing that the conversation had reached a thoughtful equilibrium. For viewers at home, part 2 of the exchange offered depth rather than drama. It showed how a live talk show can host a serious disagreement without devolving into conflict, allowing space for complexity and reflection. The conversation continued to unfold naturally, setting the stage for further exploration rather than resolution, and reminding audiences that meaningful dialogue often lives in the gray areas between certainty and silence. As the segment moved forward, the conversation took on a slightly different texture, not because the disagreement had been resolved, but because both sides seemed more aware of where the other was coming from. The initial tension gave way to a steadier rhythm, one that felt more exploratory than defensive. For viewers watching live, it was clear that the discussion had shifted from stating positions to examining consequences, a natural evolution when a talk show exchange deepens rather than escalates. The moderator introduced a related question, asking how public conversations have changed in recent years and whether that shift has altered the responsibilities of both media figures and guests. The question opened the door to a broader discussion, and Joaquin Phoenix responded by reflecting on how constant visibility has compressed complex ideas into moments that are easily misunderstood. He spoke about how interviews now live beyond the studio, circulating online without context, and how that reality affects how he chooses his words. His tone remained calm, but there was a noticeable seriousness as he described the long afterlife of live television moments. Whoopi Goldberg listened carefully, then responded by agreeing that the media landscape has changed, but added that this is precisely why clarity matters more than ever. She pointed out that ambiguity can be interpreted in multiple ways once a clip leaves the studio. Her body language remained open, but her delivery was direct, suggesting that while she understood Joaquin's caution, she still believed in the importance of being explicit when possible. The audience reacted with light applause, signaling recognition of a point that resonated with their own experiences of consuming media online. Another co-host interjected to note that the show itself often revisits conversations sparked by viral clips, sometimes to clarify intent after the fact. This acknowledgement added a layer of self-awareness to the discussion. Joaquin nodded, agreeing that follow-up matters, but he questioned whether clarification always reaches the same audience as the original moment. He suggested that once a narrative takes hold, it can be difficult to redirect, regardless of intention. The exchange remained measured, but the differing philosophies were still evident. Joaquin leaned forward slightly as he spoke, emphasizing his concern about unintended impact. Whoopi, in response, maintained steady eye contact, signaling engagement rather than opposition. She replied by sharing how she approaches these situations, explaining that she often prefers to state her position plainly, even if it risks criticism, because it leaves less room for misinterpretation. Her words carried the weight of experience, and the studio audience responded with a mix of murmurs and applause. At this point, the moderator briefly stepped in to summarize what had been said so far, a common technique on daytime television when discussions grow complex. She framed the exchange as a conversation about intention versus impact, restraint versus responsibility. This framing helped ground the discussion and allowed viewers to follow along without feeling lost. Joaquin acknowledged the summary with a nod, and Whoopi added a brief comment agreeing that the balance between those ideas is difficult but necessary. The conversation then turned toward generational differences in communication. One co-host suggested that younger audiences often expect immediate responses from public figures, while older viewers may be more comfortable with reflection and delay. Joaquin responded by noting that expectation itself can create pressure, especially when silence is interpreted as avoidance. He emphasized that taking time to think should not be seen as a flaw, but as a sign of respect for the issue at hand. Whoopi responded by acknowledging generational shifts, but she also pointed out that expectations don't exist in a vacuum. She argued that when someone has a platform, people will project meaning onto their actions and inactions alike. Her point wasn't dismissive of Joaquin's concerns, but it reinforced her belief that awareness of perception is part of public life. The audience remained attentive, reacting with small gestures rather than loud applause, reflecting the thoughtful nature of the exchange. As the discussion continued, interruptions became slightly more frequent, not out of conflict, but as a way to keep the conversation dynamic. Hosts occasionally jumped in to clarify a point or redirect a question, ensuring that the segment remained accessible to a broad audience. Joaquin adapted to this rhythm, responding succinctly when necessary, while still maintaining the depth of his answers. One notable moment came when Joaquin acknowledged that his perspective is shaped by his own discomfort with public discourse. He admitted that he often struggles with the performative aspects of interviews and discussions, and that this discomfort informs his cautious approach. This candid admission seemed to shift the energy in the room. Whoopi responded with empathy, noting that not everyone thrives in the same communicative spaces, and that recognizing those differences is important. However, she followed this by reiterating that discomfort doesn't remove influence. Her delivery was gentle but firm, reinforcing her central argument without dismissing Joaquin's vulnerability. The audience responded with a brief round of applause, acknowledging the honesty on both sides. This moment underscored that the disagreement wasn't about right or wrong, but about navigating complex realities from different starting points. The moderator then asked how these ideas play out when difficult questions are asked directly, such as in interviews or press conferences. Joaquin replied that he prefers questions that allow for exploration rather than confrontation, but he understands that not all formats allow for that. He emphasized that his goal is to engage honestly, even if his answers aren't always concise. Whoopi responded by pointing out that talk shows often serve as a bridge between complexity and accessibility, striving to make nuanced ideas understandable within limited time. As the segment edged closer to its later stages, the conversation felt more cohesive, even as differences remained. The hosts appeared more relaxed, occasionally smiling or nodding in agreement. Joaquin and Whoopi exchanged brief moments of acknowledgement, signaling mutual respect. The audience's reactions remained steady, with applause punctuating moments of clarity rather than conflict. For viewers at home, Part 3 offered a deeper look into how thoughtful disagreement can evolve on live television. The exchange demonstrated that tension doesn't have to lead to escalation, and that differing viewpoints can coexist within a respectful framework. The conversation continued to build, not toward a dramatic climax, but toward a clearer understanding of the underlying values driving each perspective, setting the stage for how the segment would eventually wind down. As the discussion moved into its later phase, the energy in the studio became noticeably steadier. The earlier tension had settled into something more reflective, and the hosts appeared increasingly comfortable allowing longer responses and fewer interruptions. For viewers watching live, it felt as though the conversation had earned that space, having built slowly and carefully through multiple perspectives. Joaquin Phoenix remained composed, speaking with the same measured tone, while Whoopi Goldberg continued to engage with the ease of someone accustomed to navigating complex conversations in real time. The moderator introduced another angle, asking how moments of disagreement like this one are perceived by audiences who may already feel divided on similar issues. The question subtly shifted the focus from the speakers themselves to the broader impact of the conversation. Joaquin responded by saying that disagreement, when handled respectfully, can actually be reassuring to viewers. He suggested that seeing adults disagree without hostility models a healthier way to engage with difficult topics. His words were calm, and he briefly gestured toward the table, as if including everyone in that responsibility. Whoopi nodded at that point, agreeing that respectful disagreement is valuable. She added that daytime television, in particular, has a role in showing how people with different views can share the same space. Her voice carried a note of conviction, and she emphasized that disagreement doesn't have to mean dismissal. The audience responded with a more sustained round of applause, reflecting appreciation for the tone of the exchange itself. One of the co-hosts then asked Joaquin whether he ever worries that restraint might be mistaken for detachment. Joaquin acknowledged that this is a risk he's aware of, but he explained that he tries to mitigate it by being present and engaged when he does speak. He emphasized listening as an active choice, not a passive one. His explanation was deliberate, and he paused briefly between sentences, allowing the audience to absorb his point. Whoopi responded by saying that listening is often undervalued in public discourse, but she returned to her central concern about visibility. She noted that when someone is as recognizable as Joaquin, even moments of listening are observed and interpreted. Her tone was neither critical nor dismissive, but it underscored the reality of public life. The audience reacted with quiet murmurs, signaling recognition rather than surprise. At this stage, the moderator lightly redirected the conversation toward how such discussions continue after the cameras stop rolling. She asked whether Joaquin feels compelled to clarify his positions once a segment airs. Joaquin said that he often reflects on how conversations are received, but he tries not to overcorrect in response to every reaction. He explained that chasing every interpretation can become overwhelming and counterproductive. His posture remained relaxed, but his expression suggested genuine contemplation. Whoopi offered a complimentary perspective, sharing that she sometimes addresses viewer feedback directly on later episodes, especially when she feels something was misunderstood. She framed this not as damage control, but as continuation of the conversation. Her words highlighted a difference in approach, but not a conflict. Joaquin acknowledged that strategy, noting that different personalities find different ways to engage with audiences over time. The hosts began to smile more frequently as the exchange progressed, a sign that the segment was approaching a natural close. One co-host remarked that conversations like this often resonate because they reflect discussions happening in families and workplaces. Joaquin agreed, saying that disagreement is part of everyday life, and that public platforms can either inflame or illuminate those differences. Whoopi added that illumination requires effort from everyone involved, not just the person speaking. Throughout this part of the segment, the audience remained attentive, reacting with applause at moments of consensus and quiet at moments of reflection. There were no audible gasps or dramatic reactions, reinforcing the grounded nature of the exchange. The body language at the table was open, with no one leaning away or crossing arms defensively. Instead, the hosts and guest appeared physically aligned, signaling mutual respect. As time constraints became more apparent, the moderator began to guide the conversation toward closure. She thanked Joaquin for his openness and Whoopi for her perspective, framing the discussion as an example of thoughtful dialogue rather than disagreement. Joaquin expressed appreciation for the space to explain his views, and Whoopi reciprocated, emphasizing that conversation is only productive when people are willing to listen. The final moments of Part 4 felt calm and deliberate. The disagreement that had sparked the exchange was still present, but it had been contextualized and softened through discussion. Viewers were left with a sense that the conversation had matured rather than intensified. The audience applauded once more, not loudly, but warmly, as the show prepared to transition to its final segment. For those watching at home, this portion of the discussion reinforced the idea that live television can host nuanced conversations without resorting to spectacle. The exchange between Joaquin Phoenix and Whoopi Goldberg demonstrated how differing viewpoints can coexist on a daytime talk show, handled with professionalism and care. As the cameras lingered briefly on the table, there was a shared understanding that the conversation had reached a natural pause, setting the stage for how it would be wrapped up and reflected upon in the final moments of the episode. As the segment moved toward its conclusion, the moderator signaled the final moments by thanking Joaquin Phoenix again for joining the panel. Her tone was warm and composed, the familiar cadence viewers recognize when a live discussion is coming to a close. Joaquin responded with a brief expression of gratitude, acknowledging the hosts and the audience, and emphasizing that he appreciated the opportunity to have a conversation that allowed for nuance rather than quick conclusions. Whoopi Goldberg added a final thought before the wrap-up, returning to the central theme of the exchange. She reiterated that disagreement, when approached with respect, can deepen understanding rather than divide it. Her delivery was calm and assured, and she framed her comment as an invitation for viewers to reflect rather than a directive to agree. Joaquin nodded in response, signaling that while their perspectives differed, the exchange itself had been worthwhile. The studio audience reacted with sustained applause, louder than at earlier points in the segment, suggesting appreciation for the tone and substance of the discussion. There were no boos, no visible signs of discomfort, just a sense that viewers in the room had witnessed something thoughtful and grounded. The camera briefly panned across the audience, capturing attentive faces and approving nods before returning to the table. As the show transitioned away from the segment, the moderator teased the next topic, a standard move that gently shifted the energy back to the broader flow of the program. Joaquin shook hands with a couple of the hosts as the cameras pulled back, and Whoopi offered a brief smile, signaling closure rather than lingering tension. The conversation had ended not with resolution, but with mutual acknowledgement. In the hours after the episode aired, the exchange began to circulate online, particularly among viewers who appreciate measured discussions on daytime television. Clips of the conversation were shared on social media, often accompanied by commentary noting the respectful nature of the disagreement. Some viewers sided more closely with Joaquin's emphasis on restraint and reflection, while others resonated with Whoopi's argument about awareness and influence. Many comments, however, focused less on choosing sides and more on praising the civility of the exchange. On fan forums and comment sections, viewers discussed how rare it feels to see public figures disagree without talking over one another. Some highlighted Joaquin's thoughtful pauses and careful phrasing, while others pointed to Whoopi's clarity and experience as grounding elements of the discussion. A number of viewers noted that the segment felt relatable, reflecting conversations they've had in their own lives about when to speak up and when to listen. In follow-up discussions on subsequent episodes, the hosts briefly referenced the conversation, framing it as an example of the kind of dialogue they aim to foster. There was no attempt to rehash or escalate the disagreement, but rather to acknowledge that it sparked thoughtful responses from the audience. Whoopi mentioned that she appreciated the feedback from viewers who felt seen by the conversation, reinforcing her point about engagement and transparency. Joaquin, for his part, did not issue any extended statements or clarifications, but in later interviews, he echoed similar sentiments about the importance of thoughtful communication. He referenced the value of spaces that allow for complexity, without singling out the exchange directly. This approach aligned with what viewers had seen on the show, reinforcing the consistency of his perspective. The segment ultimately became one of those moments that linger quietly rather than loudly. It didn't dominate headlines or spark controversy, but it stayed with viewers who value substantive discussion. It demonstrated how a daytime talk show can handle disagreement in a way that feels authentic and constructive, without sacrificing the accessibility expected by a broad audience. As the episode settled into its usual post-air life, The conversation between Joaquin Phoenix and Whoopi Goldberg stood as a reminder that live television can still create space for meaningful exchange. It showed that differing viewpoints don't have to lead to division, and that respectful challenge can be just as compelling as agreement. And now, after hearing how this moment unfolded on air and beyond, share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.